Hey guys, welcome back to PHP Fundamentals, and in today's lesson I want to extend upon what we did in the Sessions video. So if you'll remember, we have login.php and we mostly had this procedural code, but now I want to start getting in the process of abstracting away some of these bits out so that they can be reused. So the first example is if we go to admin.php, and by the way, if you have not watched the previous lesson in this course on Sessions, go ahead and give that a quick watch. That way you'll be caught up and you'll understand everything that we've written so far. Okay, so now I'm within admin.php, and we have this section right here. And this code's entire reason for existing is to verify that the user is logged in. So think about it. What if we had a different admin page? Maybe we had profile.php, and that should be secure as well. Well, if we didn't have a function, we would more or less just copy and paste this exact bit of code, and clearly that's not a good idea. So now we're going to get started building a functions file, and this will take you to the next step of mature coding. Okay, and within this folder, for now, we'll just create a new file called functions.php, right? And now I'm going to take this entire bit of code out, and we're going to add a function. So what should we call this? Well, this bit of code, what does it do? It verifies that the user is logged in. So why don't we give it a name of is logged in, like that. Now I'm going to paste that in and clean up the code just a bit. Get rid of the comment. And now we can see if is set session username, we're going to relocate to login.php, and then we're going to die. All right, so this could be improved a bit, but for now, we at least have this reusable bit of code. And now let's get rid of all of this. And if I come back and we go to admin.php, that file is going to load because we've removed that error checking. So now let's add it back in, and we'll call is logged in. But at this point, just creating the functions file isn't enough. We need to include it. So we can do that right here. Include functions.php. There we go. So now we've started up a new session. We've included any files that we need. And in fact, you'll often see that people will do this at the top, and that's okay. So we include functions, we start up a session, and then we verify that the user is logged in. Now, if I reload the page, now it's working. I go to admin. Good, and now we've abstracted this code away to a reusable function. Great. Now in this case though, we want to get behind the idea of that a function should do exactly one thing. So this is fine, but it does have a lot of logic. For example, what if we want to redirect somewhere else if they're not logged in? Really what this function should do is simply return whether the user's session has been initiated, essentially. So why don't we do this instead? Why don't we say if not is set session username, return false. And then we're going to improve this or refactor it even more in just a second, but I want to give you the first taste of how you might do it. So if the session username key is not set, then we're going to return false. Otherwise, we're going to return true. All right, that can definitely be improved, but keep it like that for now. Now I'm going to go back to admin.php, and we can say if is logged in. Then we can do whatever we need to, or if they're not logged in, then we can set the header, go wherever we need to, login.php, and then we can die. All right, so let's reload the page. I'm going to go to admin.php, and now that's working as well. But what if they are logged in? Well, let's try it. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're logged in. Good. Let's try to load the page again. And what's happening is this is failing, so this code never runs. Good. And this is a cleaner way to create your function. We've set is logged in. This function does exactly one thing. Think of it like a fast food place, like McDonald's. When McDonald's first launched, they realized that they could be far more efficient and cheap if they took each employee and essentially gave them a factory job. You're responsible for this one thing. So one guy is responsible for the fries, one guy is responsible for the burgers. And the advantage to this is when you're doing one thing over and over again, you can do it much faster because you become a master at it. And the second thing is, when everyone doesn't have to know how to run the entire store, essentially, you can pay them less. So it's a weird example in this context, but I think it works. The basic idea is your functions, they do one thing and one thing only. And that way, you're not having too much logic. You don't have 20 lines within a function. If you do have 20 lines in your function, it's very possible that there's a code smell going on and you should refactor that code. And speaking of refactoring, we're going to do that right now. So this is something fairly common. Actually, what's even more common is this, return true. So we're going to refactor this function. Well, the first step is, if not is set username return false, else return true. Well, as I just demonstrated, why do else return true when there isn't anything else within this function? You could just remove that entirely and do return false. Now we've refactored it, but we can refactor it even more. If you think about it, all we want to do is return a Boolean, or true or false, depending upon what this test returns. So isSet session username is going to return true or false. So notice that we're being a little bit redundant here. This returns true, but then we don't take that captured value, we put it within an if conditional, and then we manually return false or, true, dependent upon that test. So why don't we do this instead? Why don't we get rid of the if statement entirely, like so, and now we're simply going to return isSet session username, like so. So now think about it. We have removed about 5 lines of code, but we're getting the same thing. We're going to run this test, isSet session username. That will return true or false. So whatever that value is what gets returned from the function. So now if they are logged in, we're going to return true. If they're not logged in, we're going to return false. Let's try it again. That looks good. We're logged in, so that's working, but I'm going to log out. Now I'm going to go back to admin.php, and it's working. So notice, always be refactoring your code, but that doesn't mean make your code as short as possible. That's not good either. You want your code to be as readable as possible, but you don't want it to be superfluous, where you're having all these extra lines that really aren't necessary. So this is a good function. It does one thing and one thing only. Next, let's look at some other areas that we can abstract away. So here we have our define, but it makes sense that should probably be within a config file. So I'm going to create that now, config.php, and I'm going to go back to login, and I'm going to take those lines out, and we're going to paste them in like so. All right, so now we have this config file, and this is where you would set up any configuration options for your website. Here we're setting a username and password, but in another project, maybe you could set up your database credentials, or some specific rules that need to be applied to the website, or a base URL for the website, stuff like that. Now we can use that. If we go back to login.php, I can write include config.php. So now we're going to get the exact same thing. We should be able to log in. But now, once again, we've abstracted some code away to its own file. And that way, if we need to access this again, we don't have to rewrite it in a new page. We simply include config.php. Next, let's see what else we can do. Well, we grab the values, that looks good, but then we have this section right here. And notice I had this note, viewer, can this be abstracted away? Yes, it can. So let's get rid of that. And now let's grab this code right here, and let's think about what it does. Well, this code ensures that the username and password that the user enters into the login text boxes match what we have stored, ideally within a database, but in this case, what we have stored within constants. So let's take that code and add it to our functions file. And because we're going to add it to our functions file, I want to make sure that I include functions.php. Now we're going to create a function called validate user creds, or validate user credentials. And I'm going to paste that in. So the first thing we see here is we're working with some variables, username and password. So that means this function needs to accept the username and password. Okay, well now let's go back to login.php, and we're going to call that function like so, and I'm going to pass in the username and password. Now let's go back, so let's continue on. So if what the user enters into the text box equals username, and notice that we will have access to this username constant because the config file was included previously. Now we're testing, do those values match? If so, the credentials are correct. So we set the username and we relocate to admin.php. But once again, this function is doing too much. This function's only job should be to validate the user's credentials. So with that in mind, why don't we once again come up and return whether username equals username and password equals password, like so. Then I can take these two lines out. I'll come back to login.php and we can say if validate user credentials. In that case, then we're going to set the username and we're going to relocate wherever we want to, because that may be different for each page. Next, if I come back to functions, we have this else statement, so I will copy that. I'm going to get rid of that entirely. There we go. And now I can say else, and we can do whatever we need to do in this particular case. Here, we're going to set this status variable. So now, once again, we have another function. I'll get rid of that comment because it's redundant in this case. And that is a note I want to make about commenting. Commenting your code is a very good practice under one condition: you're not being superfluous. So in this case, I would never want to have a comment that said, validate the user's credentials. Something like that, it's completely redundant. The function perfectly implies that. You should add comments when it adds to the readability of your code. And if your code is completely unreadable, well, maybe that's a code smell that you should look into, and commenting may not be the perfect solution. All right, so now we've created these two helpful functions: is the user logged in, and validate the user's credentials. Good. Let's go back and test it out one more time. Jeffrey Way, 1234. That looks good. Let's log out. And one more time, do the wrong credentials. I'll log in, and everything's working exactly as it did before. But now we've created this helper function that we can use from page to page if necessary. And those are the two main things I wanted to cover for this lesson without digging too much. So the main things I want you to take from this are, we are creating small, reusable functions. They don't do too much. They're not redirecting to different locations. They do one job, because that's what they are. These are helper functions. Next, we've begun abstracting some of this code to their own files, and this is a good practice. You have a config file for your configuration options for your website or application. You have a functions file for any functions that you need. What I want you to think about, though, is notice that we're including config and functions, and then if we go to admin, we're including functions. So we're getting a little bit redundant here, where we are including lots of files from page to page. And this is something that you will learn how to fix, where everything is routed through one specific file. So if you think about it, if we routed all requests to our website through a page like index.php, that file could then be responsible for including any specific classes or files for the entire project. It could include a config file and then load the necessary content depending upon what the URL was. So that's still a ways off. We're not there yet, but I want you to get into that mindset of how could we route everything to make ourselves write less code. Okay, my name is Jeffrey Way. In the next lesson, we're going to dig into cookies.